He demanded a salute from a royal guard to prove his authority. But he never expected her response to turn his world upside down. The sleek black motorcade rolled through the gates of Buckingham Palace with the precision of a military drill, coming to a smooth stop near the visitors' entrance on a crisp April morning in 25. A light mist hung in the air, softening the edges of the palace's historic stonework while amplifying the vibrant colors of its meticulously maintained gardens. The grounds buzzed with the usual mix of tourists and official visitors, their excited murmurs creating a constant backdrop to the day's events. The vehicles bore diplomatic flags, signaling the arrival of an American military delegation for the annual NATO Strategic Leadership Summit. Curious onlookers paused to snap photos, their phones raised to capture the formal arrival. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Carter of the United States Army stepped out of the lead vehicle, adjusting his immaculate uniform with the precision of a man who lived by military standards. At 42 years old, Carter was an imposing figure. At 6'3", his broad shoulders filling out his uniform, each medal and ribbon on his chest telling the story of a distinguished career across multiple combat zones: Iraq, Syria, and a classified operation in the South China Sea. His short-cropped, graying hair and steely blue eyes gave him the look of a seasoned commander. But beneath his professionally neutral expression was a hint of impatience. All this pomp for what's essentially a meeting, he remarked to Major Rachel Evans, his aide, as he surveyed the palace grounds. "We could have done this at the Pentagon and skipped the theatrical entrance." Major Evans, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-30s, gave a non-committal nod, her attention already drawn to the iconic figure standing at attention nearby. A royal guard in full ceremonial regalia stood near the entrance, her scarlet tunic brilliant against the weathered palace stonework. Corporal Anna Sinclair, 31 years old, stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed forward in the disciplined thousand-yard stare perfected through years of service. Carter's gaze followed Evans, lingering on Sinclair with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Incredible detail on the uniform," he commented, his tone caught between grudging admiration and mockery. "Though I wonder how practical that bearskin cap would be in a real combat zone." Lieutenant Colonel, came a polite but firm voice, Edward Clark, the palace tour coordinator, approached with a diplomatic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. A wiry man in his late 40s, Clark had spent years managing high-profile visits, and his instincts for maintaining protocol were razor-sharp. "If you'd kindly rejoin your group, we have a precisely timed schedule to maintain." As the delegation walked the palace grounds, Carter remained distracted, his attention repeatedly drawn to the royal guards positioned at various points. "Tell me," he said suddenly, interrupting Clark's explanation of the palace's historic rose varieties. "These guards, they're just ceremonial, right? For the tourists." Before Clark could respond, Carter turned to his American colleagues, a faint smirk on his lips. "It's like having mannequins in uniform. Back home, we put our soldiers to actual use." Colonel Margaret Thompson, the senior American officer of the delegation, frowned slightly. A seasoned leader in her early 50s, Thompson had a reputation for diplomacy as much as for strategy. "The Royal Guards are an operational battalion of the British Army." "Daniel," she said evenly, "they rotate between ceremonial duties and regular deployments." Carter raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Seems inefficient to have combat-trained personnel standing like statues. In the Army, we optimize utility." Across the garden, Captain Thomas Reed of the Royal Guard Command noticed Carter's gestures towards Sinclair's position. Reed, a 38-year-old officer with a decade of experience overseeing the Royal Guards, had developed an instinct for spotting potential incidents before they escalated. What Carter couldn't know was that Corporal Anna Sinclair had been specifically chosen for today's duty because of her exceptional discipline and judgment. Just 4 months prior, Sinclair had completed her 3rd combat deployment, serving with distinction in a classified joint operation in Eastern Europe, where her unit had extracted high-value intelligence assets under heavy fire. That operation had earned her the Military Cross for Valor. Though the details remained classified, her personnel file contained commendations from American Special Forces commanders who described her as unflappable under pressure and a model of discipline in chaotic conditions, qualities that made her perfect for both combat in Royal Guard duty. I served alongside the Queen's Guard in Ukraine, offered Major James Holloway, a British military attaché accompanying the group. A lean man in his early 40s with a faint scar across his cheek, Holloway spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen action. Some of the finest soldiers I've encountered. Carter gave Holloway a skeptical look, his impatience bubbling to the surface. No disrespect to your forces, Major, but there's a difference between theatrical performance and combat readiness. These palace mannequins might look impressive, but modern warfare demands constant training and tactical flexibility, not standing still for hours. We'll take a brief moment here to admire the Western facade before continuing to the changing of the guard ceremony. Clark announced to the delegation, hoping to steer the group back on schedule. As the group dispersed slightly to take photographs, Carter seized the opportunity. Slipping away with practiced ease, he moved with purpose across the grounds, straight toward Corporal Sinclair's post. Carter positioned himself directly in Sinclair's line of sight, deliberately inserting himself into her 1,000-yard stare. "Impressive discipline," he remarked, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "Though I wonder what tactical advantage comes from standing motionless while a potential threat evaluates your position." A small group of tourists had gathered nearby. Sensing the unusual interaction, most visitors maintained a respectful distance from the guards, but Carter closed to within arm's length, examining Sinclair with the critical eye of a drill instructor looking for faults in a new recruit. "In the Army, we train our soldiers to respond to threats, not ignore them," he continued, circling Sinclair slowly. "This ceremonial rigidity might look good on postcards, but military effectiveness is measured by adaptability. Wouldn't you agree?" Sinclair remained perfectly still, giving no indication she'd heard the provocative comments. Lieutenant Colonel called Major Evans, who had noticed Carter's absence and followed him, her voice tinged with concern. "The delegation is moving on." Carter waved her off without looking back. "Just having a professional exchange with our British counterpart here," he said, his emphasis on professional carrying unmistakable sarcasm. Evans finally succeeded in pulling Carter away, but he paused, looking directly into Sinclair's eyes. "We'll continue this discussion later." "Corporal," he said, misreading the insignia on her uniform, "I'm curious to see how this ceremonial training translates to real military engagement." The delegation had progressed halfway through their tour when Carter broke away again, this time with such deliberate purpose that even Colonel Thompson's sharp Lieutenant Colonel Carter failed to slow his stride. A larger crowd had gathered near the guard post now, mid-morning tour groups arriving with their cameras and guidebooks. Carter positioned himself directly before Sinclair, whose eyes remained fixed forward in perfect discipline. He was determined to make a point, and he was about to cross a line that would change everything. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Carter stood directly in front of Corporal Anna Sinclair, his imposing 6'3" frame casting a shadow over the Royal Guard as the mid-morning sun filtered through the light mist at Buckingham Palace. The crowd of tourists had thickened, their cameras and guidebooks in hand, sensing something unusual unfolding near the palace gates. Anna, in her scarlet tunic and bearskin cap, remained a picture of disciplined stillness, her eyes fixed forward in the 1,000-yard stare that had defined her post all morning. But Carter, with his steely blue eyes and a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, was determined to make a point. He'd spent 22 years in the U.S. Army, leading troops through combat zones from Iraq to Syria, and he wasn't about to let a ceremonial mannequin ignore his authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carter announced, his voice booming with the practiced authority of a senior officer addressing a battalion. "You're witnessing a fascinating contrast in military philosophies today." He gestured toward Anna with a theatrical sweep of his arm, his medals glinting in the sunlight. "This represents the British approach. Ceremonial precision valued over combat readiness." The crowd murmured, some tourists exchanging uneasy glances, while others raised their phones to capture the moment. A young couple from Texas whispered to each other, the woman muttering, "He's not supposed to be that close, is he?" Carter turned back to Anna, his tone sharpening as he continued. "In my 22 years with the United States Army, I've led soldiers through 3 combat deployments: Baghdad, Aleppo, and the South China Sea. In each instance, our success depended on adaptability, tactical awareness, and immediate response to changing threats. He stepped even closer, violating the respectful distance maintained by other visitors, his polished boots stopping just inches from Anna's position. "Tell me, Corporal, how does standing motionless prepare you for the chaos of modern combat?" An elderly British man in the crowd, his blazer adorned with military medals from his own service decades ago, stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "Sir, you're out of line. These guards have served in the same combat zones you mentioned. Their ceremonial duty represents discipline, not deficiency." Carter turned, assessing the older man with a quick glance at his medals. "With respect, sir," Carter replied, his tone clipped, "I'm simply highlighting different approaches to military readiness. A soldier who spends hours practicing standing still isn't developing the tactical flexibility modern warfare demands." The tension in the air was palpable now, the crowd's murmurs growing louder as Carter's words echoed across the courtyard. Major Rachel Evans, Carter's aide, stood at the edge of the group, her sharp eyes darting between her superior and the growing number of onlookers. "Lieutenant Colonel," she called, her voice tinged with urgency. "The delegation is moving on." But Carter ignored her, his focus locked on Anna. He stepped closer still, close enough that his next words were meant for her alone, though they carried to those nearby. "Have you ever actually seen combat, Corporal? Or did they put you here because you look good in red?" A woman in the crowd gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as Carter's provocation hung in the air. Colonel Margaret Thompson, the senior American officer, finally broke free from her diplomatic obligations and strode toward Carter, her expression a mix of frustration and alarm. "Lieutenant Colonel Carter," she barked, her voice cutting through the tension, "rejoin the delegation immediately." But Carter wasn't finished. The delegation's scheduled viewing of the changing of the guard ceremony had begun, and as the crowd shifted for better angles, he slipped away again, moving with purposeful strides toward Anna's post. By the time Major Evans realized he'd disappeared, Carter was already standing directly in Anna's line of sight, his presence a deliberate challenge to her disciplined stillness. "Your ceremonial changing of the guard is quite the performance," he announced, projecting his voice like a lecturer addressing a classroom. "Impressive choreography, I'll grant you that. But in the Army, we change posts with efficiency, not pageantry." Carter straightened to his full height, assuming a formal military bearing that signaled he was about to make an official declaration. "Let me explain something about military protocol," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "Across NATO forces, there exists a universal understanding of chain of command. Regardless of national differences, military courtesy demands that junior officers acknowledge senior officers." He tapped the insignia on his own uniform, his voice rising. "Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army. Combat decorations from 3 theaters of operation. Command experience in joint force operations." His finger jabbed toward Anna. "And you? What?" "A corporal whose primary skill is standing still." Carter reached out suddenly, his fingers brushing the sleeve of Anna's scarlet tunic between thumb and forefinger. "Wool," he remarked, his tone making the word sound like an insult. "In combat conditions, this would be a liability." The crowd tensed collectively at the physical contact. Everyone who visited the palace knew the cardinal rule: never touch the guards. He just touched her. A young British tourist whispered loudly to his friend, his eyes wide. "You're not supposed to do that." Carter's hand moved toward Anna's rifle, his fingers brushing against the barrel as he commented, "Ceremonial weapon, or actually functional." An audible murmur ran through the crowd at this second violation of protocol. Palace security personnel were moving closer now, though still maintaining diplomatic discretion given the visitor's military status. Carter positioned himself squarely before Anna, deliberately blocking her line of sight. A third violation of the protocols clearly posted for visitors. "The difference is responsiveness," Carter continued, his voice carrying across the grounds. "An Army soldier acknowledges superior officers, maintains situational awareness, responds to changing conditions." He paused, his eyes narrowing, as he delivered his final demand. "Guard, I am Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Carter, United States Army, NATO Joint Command. Authorized military protocol across Allied forces requires junior personnel to render appropriate respect to senior officers. This is a direct order from a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. His voice rang out like a gunshot. "Salute me now." The demand hung in the air, sharp and commanding, as the crowd held its collective breath. For one extended moment, Corporal Anna Sinclair remained perfectly motionless, her eyes fixed forward in the disciplined, thousand-yard stare that had remained unbroken throughout Carter's escalating provocations. Then, with a precision that observers later described as almost mechanical, her demeanor shifted. Her white-gloved hand moved with fluid efficiency to remove Carter's fingers from her rifle, her touch firm but controlled. "Sir," Anna spoke, her voice carrying the crisp articulation of British military precision. "You are in violation of standing orders regarding interaction with the Queen's Guard. Physical contact with a guard or her equipment constitutes a Category B security infraction." Carter's expression shifted from commanding to momentarily stunned. He clearly hadn't expected any response, let alone one delivered with such unapologetic authority. Furthermore, Anna continued, her gaze now directly meeting Carter's, her hazel eyes steady and unflinching. "While your rank commands appropriate respect within NATO allied forces, Standing Palace Protocol establishes clear guidelines regarding the chain of command while on royal grounds. The Queen's Guard operates under the direct authority of the Crown, not NATO command structure." She recited from memory with mechanical precision, her voice unwavering. "Standing Order 157 specifically addresses interaction with allied military personnel. Guards will maintain position and bearing, regardless of visiting military rank, as their oath is sworn first to the sovereign. My duty is to the crown first. Lieutenant Colonel, that duty includes maintaining prescribed position, bearing, and protocol, regardless of external military authority." Carter's jaw tightened, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and frustration as Anna's words sank in. She continued, her tone respectful yet unyielding. "This isn't a matter of disrespect to your rank, sir, but rather absolute respect for the oath of service I have sworn." Her white-gloved hand returned to her rifle in a motion so fluid it seemed choreographed. Resuming her ceremonial position with perfect precision, "I must respectfully request you step back to the designated viewing area and refrain from further physical contact with palace guards or equipment." "Lieutenant Colonel," the crowd erupted into whispers, a mix of shock and admiration rippling through the tourists. A young girl in the back tugged at her father's sleeve, whispering, she didn't even blink, "Daddy." The elderly British veteran who had spoken earlier nodded approvingly, a faint smile crossing his weathered face. Major Evans, standing at the edge of the crowd, exchanged a glance with Colonel Thompson, whose expression had shifted from frustration to quiet respect. "Lieutenant Colonel Carter," came a firm voice. Captain Thomas Reed, the Royal Guard commander, approached with measured strides, his uniform impeccable and his demeanor calm but authoritative. A 38-year-old officer with a decade of experience, Reed had been monitoring the situation from a distance and now stepped in to de-escalate. "I believe there might be some misunderstanding regarding protocol on palace grounds. I'm Captain Reed, Guard Commander." Carter turned to Reed, his tone sharp with indignation. "Your guard broke position to address me. Doesn't that contradict the ceremonial rigidity you're so proud of?" "Indeed, sir," Reed replied evenly, his voice factual rather than defensive. Corporal Sinclair followed Standing Order 157. Paragraph 3. In the event of physical contact or immediate security concerns, guards are authorized to respond with minimum necessary communication and action. He met Carter's gaze without flinching. "The Queen's Guard operates under a unique command structure while on palace duty. While we acknowledge NATO command protocols and joint operations, palace grounds fall under the direct authority of the sovereign, superseding standard military chain of command for visiting officers." Carter's posture remained rigid, his jaw clenched as he processed Reed's explanation. The crowd, sensing the confrontation had reached a turning point, watched in stunned silence as the American officer faced the reality of his misstep. He had expected compliance, a salute to affirm his authority, but instead, he'd been met with a lesson in discipline and protocol that he would not soon forget. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Carter stood frozen in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, the weight of Corporal Anna Sinclair's words settling over him like a lead blanket. The mid-morning mist had begun to lift, revealing the palace's historic stonework in sharp detail, but Carter's focus was elsewhere. Anna, standing in her scarlet tunic and bearskin cap, had resumed her ceremonial position with flawless precision, her white-gloved hands steady on her rifle, her hazel eyes once again fixed forward in the disciplined thousand-yard stare. The crowd of tourists who had watched the confrontation unfold with bated breath now buzzed with whispers of admiration, their earlier curiosity replaced by a newfound respect for the Royal Guard. Captain Thomas Reed, the Royal Guard commander, stood beside Carter, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the American officer's barely concealed frustration. Reed, a 38-year-old veteran with a decade of experience overseeing the guards, had stepped in to de-escalate the situation, but Carter's rigid posture and clenched jaw betrayed his struggle to process what had just happened. He had demanded a salute, expecting compliance to affirm his authority as a senior NATO officer. Instead, he'd been met with a composed, unyielding explanation of protocol that turned his assumptions upside down. In 22 years of military service across 4 continents, Carter said, his voice low but edged with indignation, I've never encountered a junior officer who refused a direct order from a superior. That's because Corporal Sinclair wasn't refusing an order. Lieutenant Colonel Reed clarified, his tone steady and professional. She was following her primary standing orders, which specify that on palace grounds, her chain of command flows through the crown, not visiting military personnel. Regardless of rank, Reed's hazel eyes met Carter's. Unflinching, her response was both appropriate and in line with her oath of service. Colonel Margaret Thompson, the senior American officer of the delegation, approached with a brisk stride, her expression a mix of frustration and diplomatic restraint. A seasoned leader in her early 50s, Thompson had hoped to avoid any incidents during this NATO summit visit, but Carter's actions had created a ripple that couldn't be ignored. Lieutenant Colonel Carter, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a commanding officer who rarely needed to raise it. You've created a diplomatic incident on what was supposed to be a routine goodwill visit. The delegation is awaiting your return. Now, Carter turned to Thompson, his face still flushed with a mix of embarrassment and defiance. British inflexibility hasn't changed since colonial times, he muttered, loud enough for nearby officers to hear as they rejoined the American delegation. They cling to outdated protocols and call it tradition. The other American officers created subtle distance between themselves and Carter as the tour continued, his isolation becoming increasingly apparent. Major Rachel Evans, Carter's aide, walked beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the group for any further signs of trouble. But she kept her thoughts to herself. Across the palace grounds, Anna Sinclair maintained her post with perfect composure. If the confrontation had affected her in any way, there was no outward sign. Her discipline was as unyielding as the palace stonework behind her. The American delegation completed their tour, proceeding toward the gates where their motorcade awaited. As they passed near Anna's post, several officers, including Colonel Thompson, offered respectful nods, subtle acknowledgments of professional courtesy that pointedly excluded Carter. They're soldiers, not statues, Carter said as they approached the vehicles, his voice carrying a defensive edge. Military effectiveness is measured by adaptability, not theatrical performance. Interesting perspective. Lieutenant Colonel, replied General Paul Harrison, an American general who had remained silent throughout the earlier incidents. A tall man in his late 50s with a commanding presence, Harrison had observed the entire exchange with a keen eye. Though I noted that Corporal Sinclair adapted quite effectively to your challenge, her response was both appropriate and professionally delivered. Tactical objective, achieved with minimum necessary force. Sounds rather effective to me. Carter's expression tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he stared stonily through the window of the motorcade. In the distance, Anna's scarlet uniform remained a vivid splash of color against the palace stonework, her unwavering discipline. The final image, as the vehicles pulled away from the gates, the elderly British veteran who had spoken earlier was explaining the situation to a group of curious American tourists nearby. The Royal Guards aren't just ceremonial figures, he told them quietly, his voice filled with pride. They're active combat soldiers, many with multiple deployments. Sinclair there served with distinction in Eastern Europe alongside American forces. Several yards away, Captain Reed was briefing a palace official on the incident, his report concise and factual. Corporal Sinclair followed protocol precisely, he said, his tone matter-of-fact. She maintained her position until physical contact necessitated a response. As per Standing Order 157, Paragraph 3, her actions prevented escalation while upholding the dignity of the Queen's Guard. The official, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard, nodded approvingly. Her record speaks for itself. 3 deployments, a military cross for valor. She's a credit to the regiment. Reed allowed himself a small smile. She is, ma'am, the same qualities that make her exceptional in combat make her perfect for this duty. Discipline under pressure, whether it's enemy fire or a foreign officer's demands. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over Buckingham Palace, Anna Sinclair completed her shift and emerged from the guard quarters in her standard combat uniform. Her ceremonial scarlet tunic and bearskin cap had been replaced by practical fatigues, but her posture remained military straight, a testament to her training. A military colleague, Sergeant Laura Bennett, approached her as they walked toward the barracks. Heard about the American officer, Bennett said, her tone light but curious, caused quite a stir. Didn't he? Anna gave a small nod, her expression neutral. He misunderstood the chain of commands. I clarified it for him. Her voice was calm, betraying no hint of the tension that had unfolded earlier. Bennett chuckled softly. Bet he wasn't expecting that. You handled it like a pro, Sinclair. It's what we're trained for. Anna replied simply. Discipline isn't just for show. It's what keeps us effective, whether we're standing guard or under fire. She paused, then added, he thought ceremonial duty meant weakness. I hope he learned otherwise. Back at the American Embassy, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Carter sat in a quiet office, the events of the day replaying in his mind. Colonel Thompson had delivered a formal reprimand, her words sharp but measured. Your actions today risked a diplomatic incident, she'd said, her tone leaving no room for argument. You failed to respect the protocols of our hosts, and in doing so, you undermined the goodwill this summit was meant to foster. I expect better from an officer of your experience. Carter had nodded stiffly, but as he sat alone, his thoughts began to shift. He'd been so focused on asserting his authority, on proving the superiority of his modern approach, that he'd overlooked the deeper meaning behind Anna's discipline. Her response hadn't been defiance for the sake of defiance. It had been a demonstration of loyalty to her oaths, a commitment to her duty that transcended rank or nationality. For the first time, Carter began to see the parallels between the ceremonial precision of the Royal Guard and the battlefield discipline he'd relied on in his own career. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to execute orders with absolute focus. Perhaps there was more to this theatrical nonsense than he'd realized. The next day, as Anna Sinclair returned to her post, the tourists who approached did so with a new respect, their whispers filled with admiration for the guard who stood her ground. Colonel Thompson, passing by with the delegation on their way to another summit event, paused to observe Anna from a distance. She turned to General Harrison, a faint smile on her lips. Discipline like that, she said quietly, is what makes soldiers effective. Whether they're in a palace courtyard or a war zone, Harrison nodded in agreement. A lesson some of us needed to learn the hard way. His gaze flickered to Carter, who walked a few steps behind, his expression more subdued than the day before. The incident at Buckingham Palace had been a humbling experience for the lieutenant colonel, a reminder that true respect for military traditions meant understanding and honoring the differences between cultures, not imposing one's own standards at the expense of others. The story of Anna Sinclair and Daniel Carter became a quiet legend among the NATO delegation, a tale of how a Royal Guard's unwavering discipline taught a seasoned officer the value of mutual respect. It was a reminder that military excellence isn't measured by rank or combat experience alone, but by the ability to bridge divides, to honor the traditions of allies, and to recognize that strength can take many forms, even in the stillness of a ceremonial post.